These are the Maldives. You won't find a more perfect paradise. Beaches with soft white sand, villas standing above clear turquoise waters, and quiet meals by the sea. It's one of the most desired and luxurious tourist destinations in the world. But the reality is much darker than it seems. Behind that perfect image hides a repressive regime that bans any religion other than Sunni Islam, where a woman can be whipped for adultery or sentenced to death for having a relationship outside of marriage, and where leaving Islam can cost you your life. You won't find any of this in the travel brochures or hotel reviews. No visitor sees it because it's designed to stay hidden. The Maldives is a religious dictatorship funded by tourists seeking freedom, while it oppresses a population that has no right to even imagine it. It's a dictatorship that doesn't need tanks to survive, just paradise islands and the silent complicity of everyone who profits from it. The Republic of the Maldives is an archipelago of 1,192 islands spread over more than 800 kilometers in the heart of the Indian Ocean. Only 188 of these islands are inhabited, and together they have just about 500,000 people. In the capital, Male, around 200,000 people live packed into less than 9 square kilometers. It is one of the most densely populated urban areas on the planet. The rest of the country is made up of small, flat islets, with no rivers, no mountains, and no major cities. This geographical layout, which seems harmless, is key to understanding the kind of system that dominates the islands today. Because in a country like this, small, spread out, with no internal mobility and only one center of power, ideological control doesn't require massive violence. It only takes repetition. There is a mosque on every island. Children learn the same lessons, and on Fridays, the imams read exactly what the state tells them to read. The population, physically separated, has almost no chance of creating alternative ideas. The Maldives is not just a beautiful country, it is a country perfectly structured to impose a single worldview. Everything revolves around Islam. It is the official religion, the only one allowed, and the foundation on which the national identity is built. The Maldives is a radicalized country, but it wasn't always like this. Before Islam took over the social, political, and spiritual life of the islands, the history was very different. For over 1,000 years, the Maldives was a Buddhist country. We know this from the archaeological remains still found on some islands, Buddha statues, the remains of stupas, and ritual inscriptions. But none of these elements are part of the official memory. They are not in school textbooks or in public speeches. The conversion to Islam came in the 12th century, driven by political and economic reasons. The kingdoms in the Indian Ocean depended on maritime trade with the Arab world, and adopting Islam was, in many cases, a way to be included in that system. But the religious radicalization that rules the islands today came much later and was not spontaneous. At first, it was a carefully planned import, funded almost entirely by Saudi Arabia. Since the 1970s, while the West was looking the other way, the Saudi kingdom began investing billions of dollars to export its religious ideology. Not just in the Maldives, also in Africa, Central Asia, and the Balkans. But here, in this small archipelago with no geopolitical weight, the strategy worked especially well. Mosques, Islamic centers, and Quranic schools were built. Religious materials were funded, texts were translated, and a conservative and intolerant version of Islam was promoted. Scholarships were also given to hundreds of young Maldivians who were sent to Riyadh, Cairo, or Islamabad to study in deeply ideological religious institutions. When they returned, they weren't just students anymore, they were preachers trained in the core teachings of Wahhabism. And they took key positions in mosques, schools, courts, and the Ministry of Islamic Affairs. The Maldives was the perfect country to test this model. Small, Muslim, poor, without a military, with no international pressure, and totally dependent on tourism and foreign aid. For Saudi Arabia, exporting its religion and controlling global Islamic discourse is a way to expand political, economic, and symbolic power without firing a single bullet. And in the Maldives, that experiment worked perfectly. But the Maldives didn't just import religion, it also learned how to use it as a tool for political control. In 1978, While Saudi Arabia was starting to fund clerics and mosques, Ma'mun Abdul Gayoom came to power. He would rule for 3 decades, becoming the longest-serving president in the country's history. His strategy was clear from the beginning: to merge political power with religious authority. Gayoom, who studied in Egypt and was influenced by conservative pan-Arab Islamic thought, was a different kind of dictator. He didn't need tanks to repress people. It was enough to present himself as the guardian of the faith. Through the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, the state controlled who could preach, what was taught in schools, and how Islam was interpreted. Religion wasn't just doctrine, it was official government policy. But Gayoom also knew that the country needed money, and that money came from tourism. During his presidency, the tourism sector expanded massively, with investments in luxury hotels, infrastructure for international visitors, and campaigns to promote the Maldives as an exclusive destination. The result was a structural contradiction that couldn't be ignored. The Maldives is a country where strict Islam rules the lives of its citizens, but Western tourism finances its economy. For a tourist arriving in the Maldives, everything looks like a dream: coral atolls, turquoise waters, and private villas floating on the ocean. It's a perfect postcard, a mix of luxury, peace, isolation, and beauty. But above all, freedom. However, that experience doesn't happen in the real country. It happens inside a carefully designed bubble made for tourists. There, visitors can drink alcohol, play music until dawn, celebrate New Year's, and wear bikinis. The same things they could do in Ibiza or Bali. But none of those freedoms exist on the islands where the Maldivian people live, because the Maldives is not just one country, it is 2 separate countries, one for tourists and another for locals. And that division is not informal. It was created, institutionalized, and perfected by the state itself once the national economy began to depend on international tourism. That separation is the core of the economic model. In fact, out of the 188 islands with a population, 28 are inhabited by local citizens, and the remaining 160 are used exclusively for resorts. Each resort island operates under an exception system. They are registered as private enclaves, under licenses that allow their operators to ignore many of the Islamic laws that apply to the rest of the country. Those islands are not under the same level of religious control. They are gray zones, tolerated out of pragmatism, not ideology. The freedoms that tourists enjoy on those islands are a product, and they are sold as a part of the vacation package. They're not true rights, as the country's own citizens aren't allowed to enjoy them. For a Maldivian to enter one of those islands, they need a work contract or special permission. They can serve the cocktails, set the tables, and entertain the guests, but they can't enjoy a single part of what they provide. On the local islands, where 99% of the population lives, alcohol is banned, clothing is subject to moral codes, and public displays of affection can be punished. Non-Islamic holidays are prohibited, and any attempt to adopt foreign behavior can be punished socially or even legally. This model is not just a contradiction, it is a system of power, a way to maintain a regime that feeds off the very freedom it forbids, and the result is a fragmented and closely watched society. Many young Maldivians grow up seeing the lights of the resort islands from the shore. They know that just a few kilometers away, people are enjoying everything they are forbidden to have. But wanting that life is dangerous. It means betraying the religion and challenging a system that does not tolerate disobedience, because it was built specifically to suppress it. The Maldives has resolved its structural paradox by isolating it, turning tourism into a product with no contact with reality. It's an artificial balance, but it works. And above all, it's fragile. Because every system has weak points, and the Maldives' weak point has always been the same. If the state ever failed, if a crisis ever got out of its control, that delicate balance between internal repression and tourist tolerance could collapse. On December 26, 2004, a 9.1 magnitude earthquake in the Indian Ocean triggered one of the most devastating tsunamis in modern history. The Maldives, with its flat and scattered territory at sea level, was completely exposed. Dozens of islands were destroyed, thousands of people lost everything, and hundreds died. The state, overwhelmed, could barely respond. And that void was filled by Islamic organizations, many of them funded from abroad. They arrived first, offering food, clean water, and help to rebuild homes. And most importantly, they built mosques, lots of mosques. Where there were once public schools, now there were religious study centers. The aid came with ideology, and the logic was simple and powerful. You survived the tsunami because God allowed it. If you want protection, you must obey His laws. In a vulnerable religious country with weak institutions, that message sank in deeply, and the result was a major shift in the country's political culture. For years, radical and violent Islamism had been a marginal trend within the Maldives' theocratic and authoritarian system. But this natural disaster disrupted that balance. In 2006, extremism made its first visible leap when an armed Islamic group took control of Himandu Island, expelled the authorities, declared their intention to enforce Sharia law, and resisted a police operation for several days. It was a symbol. For the first time, radical Islamism in the Maldives was no longer an underground current, it had become a political actor with territorial control. In 2007, the violence crossed another line when a bomb exploded in Sultan Park, in the center of the capital, Malé, injuring a dozen tourists. It was the first terrorist attack in the country's history. But this rise in extreme Islamism happened while both internal and external pressure for democratic reforms was growing. Since the late 1990s, international organizations, foreign governments, and a growing domestic opposition had been demanding an end to Maumoon Abdul Gayoom's authoritarian rule, which had lasted over 30 years. The pressure increased after the tsunami, when the international community made some of its aid conditional on political reforms. Faced with protests, demands for change, and global criticism, Gayoom finally gave in. And in 2008, he allowed the first free elections in the country's history. The result was a turning point, when activist and former political prisoner Mohamed Nasheed was elected president, defeating the dictatorship of Maumoon Abdul Gayoom after 30 years of authoritarian rule. For many, it was the beginning of a new era. Nasheed represented a deep break from the past. He promised democratic reforms, respect for human rights, a fight against corruption, and limits on political Islam. During his presidency, he tried to reduce the power of religious institutions within the government, promote a more secular education, and open the country to universal values that conflicted with the dominant Islamic orthodoxy. He was also the first world leader to draw international attention to climate change as an existential threat, stating that if sea levels rose by just 1 meter, his country would simply disappear. But that reformist push didn't last long. In 2012, only 4 years after being elected, Nasheed was forced to resign under military and political pressure, something he described as a hidden coup. The most conservative sectors, religious, business, and judicial, joined forces to remove him from power. In his place came Abdullah Yameen, half-brother of the former dictator, and with him, the return of authoritarianism, now strengthened by an even closer alliance with Saudi Arabia. During his presidency, Saudi Arabia invested in new mosques, religious training centers, Islamic cooperation agreements, and direct aid to the government. The official narrative once again focused on defending Islam, obeying the state, and the supposed threat of foreign values. Nasheed was arrested and forced into exile. The only leader who had tried to modernize the country was punished for trying. And the Maldives, which for a moment had become a democratic example, went back to being a functional theocracy, with luxury tourism and international silence. In the Maldives, religion is not just a set of beliefs. It is the law. This is not about extreme interpretations. The law itself is extreme. The Constitution clearly states that all citizens must be Sunni Muslims. No other religion is recognized, and there is no freedom of worship. Owning a Bible, wearing non-Islamic religious symbols, or questioning religious doctrines in public is illegal. The penal code directly includes punishments from Sharia law, such as flogging, stoning, and amputation. These are not isolated abuses. They are sentences handed down by state courts, backed by parliament, and protected by law. But if there's one group that embodies this legal theocracy most harshly, it is women. A woman cannot show her hair without facing consequences. She cannot marry a non-Muslim. She does not inherit equally, and if she's raped, she may be whipped for adultery. And that's only in adulthood. The repression begins much earlier. Over 90% of Maldivian women have been subjected to female genital mutilation. It is a brutal practice, with no basis in the Quran, but defended by many clerics as a way to preserve chastity. Although it is condemned in international forums, it continues to be practiced on local islands. Girls learn from a young age that they must obey, cover up, and stay silent, that their bodies are a source of shame, that their desires are a threat, and that their freedom is a sin. In schools, textbooks repeat that message, and in the streets, the religious police enforce it. In 2019, a woman was sentenced to death for having a relationship outside of marriage. There are no shelters for victims of gender violence, no sex education, and no possible defense against abuse. Even the spiritual space is controlled. Friday sermons, the most important moment for the Islamic community, are written by the state. Imams must read them word for word. They cannot improvise or interpret. There is no pluralism, no debate, no space for dissent. The Maldives is a country that has been captured by extremists, a perfectly sealed theocracy. And the worst part is that it works. It works as an economy that receives millions of dollars in luxury tourism every year. It works as a brand that sells a perfect, clean image to the outside world. And it works as an authoritarian state that maintains stability, controls the narrative, and eliminates dissent. Despite all of this, there are no international sanctions, no United Nations condemnations, and no headlines in the Western press. There is silence and complicity. And that's what's truly disturbing. Because this is not a regime that survives through violent oppression or mass fear. It's a system that survives thanks to its beautiful beaches, and thanks to everyone who prefers to look the other way. The world is not outraged by the Maldives because it doesn't see prisons or repression in the streets. What it sees is floating bungalows and infinity pools. But every postcard from the Maldives is also a warning to everyone. If the wrapping is beautiful enough, no one asks what's inside. And that is the most dangerous way to normalize a regime that doesn't need tanks to stay in power, just tourists. That's the end of today's video. If you liked it, don't miss the next one.